Hello there, welcome to Whiskey Lore. I am Drew Hanish, and it is time for another whiskey tasting and a little bit of whiskey education on top of that. I had a viewer long ago mention to me that if I was doing a tasting of some particular whiskeys, especially ones that are peated and value whiskeys, that I should get teachers. And so I'd seen teachers before, but I'd never actually made the effort to purchase it. As I was making my way back from Log Still Distillery on my recent trip to Kentucky, I stopped off at one of my favorite liquor stores in Tennessee, and there it was sitting on the bottom shelf. Nice presentation of this bottle, $10. $10. I'm like, okay, I gotta buy that. I'll buy it because it was recommended. As I understand, this is actually 40 ABV overseas, but in the United States, we get it at 43% ABV, which I think is pretty impressive for a blended whiskey. And this is Teacher's Highland Cream, which is a confusing name to me when I first read it, high in peated malt. So if you are a peat fan, note the black tie, that you may find this kind of interesting and find out some blended Scotch that is happy about promoting the fact that it is a peated malt. Now, this is a brand that goes all the way back, this to 1884, this particular version. But there has been a Teacher's whiskey around since the 1830s, and that would have been through blending at the shop that William Teacher had in Glasgow. And back then, it was illegal to blend malt whiskey with single grain whiskey. And so it wouldn't be until 1860 when the laws changed that would allow for the blending of what we now think of traditionally as a blended Scotch, being part malt and part grain neutral spirits. So, long about 1898, his sons had taken over the business and they decided it was time to open up a distillery. So they opened the Ardmore Distillery, which, if we pull out our handy-dandy map, over here you have Speyside. Well, there's Glendronach, there's Ardmore right there, then Glengarry. And the reason I mentioned those three is because there's a relation between each of them in one way or another. One is that at one point, William Teacher and Sons bought the Glendronach Distillery around 1960 and held on to it until my guest from Monday or Tuesday, Billy Walker, was involved with it shortly after that. So we talk a little bit about that in the episode. But then Glengarry, how does that relate? Well, Teachers ended up in the hands of Beam Suntory, and Beam Suntory owns a variety of distilleries throughout Scotland, and in that particular area, Glengarry is one of the distilleries that they own. And so there's a possibility that there is some juice from that distillery within this. I would think that if they're going to call it Highland Cream, then it only came from Highland distilleries, but I don't know. It's kind of a tricky title, so it's hard to know whether that's true or not. Now, this is interesting to me because when you get into cheap bourbons, and I'm telling you, $10 a bottle for a nice presentation, if you get into cheap bourbon, you're usually starting to get a little bit more of the rough stuff, although there are some very good value bourbons that you can get. Heaven Hill makes a lot of them that you can get around that $10, $12 price point. Usually got to go to Kentucky to buy them, because they do a limited release on them. But Scotches, I mean, they got to import this stuff, you know, taxes, excise, all that stuff going on, and yet they're keeping this price way down. So my anticipation for what I was going to get out of this was not very high. But what I found on the nose was a very interesting, very full profile. It definitely leads with smoke, but there's a lot of other stuff going on underneath in this particular whiskey. Now, I get kind of a minerally note out of this, which is interesting. So kind of a minerally peat coming in. It is not a iodine-based peat like you would get from a Islay distillery. This is much more of a foresty kind of a smoke. But there is that mineral note that comes in that's really curious. And it still comes from the Ardmore distillery. And I've had a version of Ardmore, and I remember that I was impressed by it, but I don't remember being overwhelmed and like I got to go get a bottle of this stuff. So I don't know the comparisons between the two. Interesting that Ardmore actually held on to their malting floors up until I think the late 1990s, somewhere in that range. So they were peating their own malt there as during that time period. There is, and maybe it's, maybe it comes down to the name and seeing Highland cream, but for some reason when I was nosing it, I was like going, oh, it does kind of have a creamy smell to it. And I was thinking, is this, you know, a liqueur? In fact, when I first tasted it, I had to look again to make sure that this wasn't a liqueur because it has a very interesting body to it. There's a little bit of maybe baked apple in there that comes through. Maybe hints of caramel, but not much. Cheers. So this is what's fascinating about this whiskey. It is heavy-bodied. It is a blend, yet it has a very rich mouthfeel to it, which you would not expect out of a $10 blend. It's impressive. It's very smoke dominated. That little bit of mineraliness comes in on the palate. Maybe a slight pepperiness. Not much, or maybe even more gingery. But it's clean on the finish. You get a little maybe burnt graham cracker note towards the end. And I get a little bit of a grapey residue on the palate. I don't know what it is. It's that sultana thing coming through again, just like a hint of that towards the finish of this. I don't think this is a caramel note. Definitely like a toasted caramel note going on in here as well. It's not a whiskey that's going to set the world on fire, but I'm telling you, for $10 a bottle, if you want a whiskey in your cabinet that when you're hanging around with friends, you want something peated, and you're just having casual conversation, it's a whiskey that will complement without interfering. And if you poured it for somebody, I don't think that, as long as they're a peat fan, they are going to be turned off by it. I think it's a matter of, if they have a refined palate, they're probably going to expect something maybe a little more elevated than this. But still, I think it serves a purpose. And I would say the best place for this may actually be, except it's going to kill your mouthfeel, is putting this in cocktails that require a nice little hint of smoke. Because I think this would have a nice, impactful flavor that would shine through in making a cocktail. And so, me, not the cocktail guy, giving cocktail advice, but you know, I think it's competent. I don't think it's going to get in the way of whatever it is that you are mixing up. What do you think of Teachers? Have you had it? And do you think that it's worth having on your shelf? I'd love to hear from you. Leave your comments below. Give me a like if you enjoyed the video, and enjoy your weekend. Until next time, cheers and Slainte. Really interesting.